committed in Gaza. He's going to be speaking on British complicity from Balfour to the present. John.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation to come down and speak. There couldn't really be a better historical moment to be discussing this subject, because we are, after all, commemorating, in some quarters, celebrating, I think it's fair to say, 100 years since the First World War, and it was the outcome of the First World War and the division of the Middle East by the major powers at the end of the First World War, which has created both the contemporary crisis in the whole of the Middle East. It is precisely the borders drawn up by two diplomats, a French diplomat called Francois Picot and an English diplomat called Hugh Sykes, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is responsible for the borders that you see on the map of the modern Middle East, and it is precisely those borders, as anybody who turns on their television news will know, that are being challenged, if not to say dissolved, by the current crisis in the Middle East. Integral to that formation of the modern Middle East is the question of Palestine and the foundation of the Israeli state, and its beginnings are in the First World War, as the leaflet for this meeting reflects. It was Lord Arthur Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, who in 1917 issued a note to the leaders of the Zionist movement promising British support for a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. Now, that's the bit which, if anybody looks any deeper into the history of the Middle East, and if anybody's interested in the roots of the Palestinian issue, they learn very quickly the issuing of the Balfour Declaration. And for most people, and I think rightly, that's an act of kind of international piracy for which the British state, then and now, should be responsible. It certainly shouldn't be, and this is the essential colonial mindset involved here, it shouldn't be for some Western power, a small island off the northwest coast of Europe, to grant to another people land which was in the possession of a third people. To even begin to think that this is the right thing to do is to have a colonial mindset, is to have the view that we here, simply because we are rich or well armed or white, have the right to tell other people thousands of miles away how their society should be run and who should possess the land in that part of the world. So that would be, if that were the whole story, that would be, in my view, bad enough. But that isn't even half the story. Because at the same time that Balfour was issuing the Balfour Declaration to the leaders of the Zionist movement, another section of the British establishment was promising precisely the same land to the Sheriff of Mecca. But they were promising those people that were leading a revolt for Arab independence that they would have precisely the same piece of land. So the notion of perfidious Albion, of the double dealing of the British Empire, is nowhere more fully on display than it is at this moment. Of course, the reasoning went like this: that the Ottoman Empire, which was then in control of these areas, all the way from modern-day Turkey down through the Middle East, through modern-day Syria, Palestine, into the Gulf Peninsula, that the Ottoman Empire was allied to Germany in the First World War, and therefore part of British operations in the Middle East was to try and bring about the collapse of Ottoman rule. And for these purposes, Sir Henry McMahon and his lieutenant, T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, were intending to and working towards mobilising an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire for the purposes of assisting them in winning in the First World War. So there were two contrary promises, two flatly contradictory promises made to two groups of people about the same piece of land during the course of the First World War and its immediate aftermath. In its immediate aftermath, with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the League of Nations, the forerunner of the United Nations, gave control over Palestine to the British. The British mandate as it was called, ran this particular part of the globe. The French Mandate ran Syria and so forth and so on. In other words, the areas previously controlled by the last empire, the Ottoman Empire, were parcelled out among the victors of the First World War. And during the 1930s, the consequences of the Balfour Declaration began to become apparent, increasing Jewish emigration into the historic land of Palestine, and the beginnings of an argument that this should now become a separate Zionist state. Now, this was enormously contested, as you can imagine. Not only did the people living in the historic area of Palestine not find this an acceptable policy, neither did any Arab in the entirety of the Middle East find this an acceptable policy. And the period of the 20s and the 30s is a period of continuous mobilization, struggle, social discontent, armed struggle in the area of Palestine. British policy during this period was to try and hold down the revolt of the Arabs, and to grant only so much to the settlers, to the Zionist settlers, as it was necessary to do. The thing that blew all this very unstable process to bits was from 1936 onwards there was a huge Arab revolt, including a massive general strike and insurrection in the Palestinian territories by the Arabs. And this drove the British to the conclusion that they couldn't hang on to the mandate any longer, and they began to draw up plans for withdrawal. What became the plan wasn't initially actually the British plan, and they were quite reluctant to go along with it, but it is nevertheless a hallmark of British imperialism that when it's forced out of somewhere, it divides and it rules, it partitions. This is what it had done in Ireland. This is what it was to do in India. It's one strategy of retreating empire. And so the notion of two states, of an Israeli state, of a Zionist state, and of an Arab state, was born in the collapse of the British Mandate in the late 1930s. Now again, just as what had transformed this region, first of all, was World War I. What transformed it again was World War II. And of course, in the course of World War II, what becomes absolutely apparent is that the British Empire is no longer the major empire in the world. The baton has passed, in the course visibly passed, from the British to the Americans. And that was a crucial development, because although the British in the Second World War had feared, as they had feared in the First World War, an Arab rising which would run beyond their control, and were therefore reluctant to give full backing to a Zionist state, the Americans had no such restraint. At the end of the Second World War, the UN plan was a partition plan. That's where the first maps of partition are driven from. That's the policy of the United States. When it comes to the vote in the United Nations over partition, the United States votes for it, the British actually vote against it. But from that point on, British foreign policy changes. It's no longer an independent foreign policy attempting to deal with the revolts and to sustain the British Empire. It is, from the Second World War on, a subordinate policy to American foreign policy. There are very good reasons for this. The British, because of the extent of empire, have a far more globalized economy, even at this stage, than any other European power. And if you have a globalized economy and a globalized financial system, and you can't defend it any longer through your own imperial forces, through your own projection of military power on a global scale, then you shelter under what the British themselves describe as the American umbrella. The globalised British economy depends from World War II onwards on being able to shelter under American military power, and British foreign policy is a subordinate version of, not without some differences and so forth and so on, but essentially is subordinate to American foreign policy. In the British Foreign Office, they even have a kind of analogy for this. They say that the Americans are like the Roman Empire. They're the sort of armed force that just kind of tread on opposition and use their military might to get their own way. But the British are like the Greeks, a more kind of intelligent empire that advises the Romans after the decline of the Greeks. Now, of course, this is A, rubbish, and B, enormously flattering to the British Foreign Office. But that's how they themselves articulate this relationship, the so-called special relationship. And that has meant, over this period of time, that the complete subordination of the British attitude towards the Israeli state, established by warfare and annexation in 1948, has been utterly supportive of it. Perhaps the best single description of the role that the Israeli state plays for American foreign policy was Ronald Reagan's, when it says it saves the cost of an aircraft carrier. In other words, it is a point in the Middle East from which American foreign policy can be projected onto the whole of the Middle East. The Israeli state, to exist, of course, has to dispossess and hold down the Palestinians, but that's not its sole. It's not its sole function. And it couldn't begin to explain why the Americans and therefore the British arm and supply the Israeli state to the degree that it does. That wouldn't be worth it. It wouldn't be cost effective simply to hold down the Palestinians. What is cost effective is if this state holds down not just the Palestinians, but the entire masses throughout the Middle East. If it plays that role, then it's got some kind of purchase. And we should remind ourselves exactly how unique the relationship is between the Israeli state and the American state. It is not only the case that the Israeli state is the biggest recipient of American military aid, it is, but it is also the biggest recipient of American civilian aid. It is the only state in the world that can directly purchase American armaments from American arms manufacturers without going through the State Department. It is the only state in the world that can use American military aid to purchase military materials from third parties. It is the only state in the world that can use American civilian aid for the purchase of military materials. Now, the British think that they've got a special relationship with the Americans, but compared to the Israelis, they really don't. That is the special relationship in modern international politics, that relationship. And the British have gone along with that, enthusiastically gone along with that. As Lockheed Martin supplies an enormous amount of this, but BAE Systems also supplies arms. The Americans provide the key diplomatic, political and strategic support to the Israeli state, but so do the British. So that's the key evolutionary moment in the support of the Israeli state, and it's never been challenged. It has never been effectively challenged from within either the British foreign policy establishment or the American foreign policy establishment, for the simple reason that that relationship is too important for the whole for the security. There's a sort of euphemism for constant warfare, but the security of the United States and Western interests in the entirety of the Middle East. I think the crisis at the moment, and there is a crisis now of legitimacy for the Israeli state on an unparalleled scale internationally. The vote in the British Parliament is only one of many in Sweden and so forth and so on. The public opinion polls now show much greater sympathy for the Palestinian cause than at any point since the establishment of the State of Israel. That crisis is a product of the essential nature of the Israeli state. It began as a settler colonial operation, as a land grab of somebody else's land being taken and given to other people. And that dynamic has never ceased. That is intrinsic to the way in which that state works. And many of you will already have seen the map of the vanishing Palestinian territories, and that isn't ended. Even now in Jerusalem, even now with the settler communities, even now in the Negev desert, the Israeli state is still expanding and still taking land from Palestinians, and it is still supported by the British establishment and still supported by the American foreign policy elite in all parties, because their strategic interests in this vital part of the world are guaranteed, are underwritten by the existence of the Israeli state. But that isn't true now, increasingly isn't true of the vast majority of ordinary people internationally. The enormous explosion of pro-Palestinian sentiment, the incredible mobilizations over the last 10 years and more, have changed the political environment in which that's the case. And the Israeli cabinet is well aware of that. It has reports about that. It detests London. It describes London as the centre of what it calls a red-green alliance. And green in this case is not the Green Party, as you probably have gathered. This is to indicate that there's an alliance between the left and the Muslim community which is driving a pro-Palestinian cause, and which the Israelis put an enormous amount of effort into trying to suppress and to counter. So I would say that we are at a pivotal moment in two senses. The expansionism of the Israeli state is close to physically annihilating the Palestinian people. But the level of support that the Palestinians now have is close to delegitimizing the Israeli state in a way that has never been delegitimized before. So I hope that some of that history and some of that analysis will encourage you to be part of that movement.
So I think if we want to take it to questions, so I guess we'll take 3 questions at a time. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, right, okay. Well, I just thought it would be probably convenient at this point just to maybe just give a brief encapsulation of how the Middle East, say around Israel and Palestine, has responded to this, and how their opinion has evolved.
Yeah, do you want to go ahead?
I think movements like the Million Man March against war in Iraq and other anti-war movements, what more can possibly be done than been done already?
Is there a third question? Yeah.
Yeah. Following the Arab uprising and sort of also the rejection by the other Arab tribes in Saudi Arabia and all these other tribes that rejected it, and even told them that we would battle or something. Why didn't Britain completely back off supporting Zionism? Why did they continue supporting both sides at the same time?
Okay. Well, the first and third questions are connected, really. The basic architecture of the Middle East is this, as far as the Palestinian question is concerned, at any rate. There is across the Middle East, in my experience, certainly in those countries that I've been in and those that I've looked at, there is among the mass of the population overwhelming support for the Palestinian cause. If you get into a cab in Cairo, the cab driver is going to be automatically pro-Palestinian in the way that if you get into a cab in this country, people are kind of automatically in favour of the NHS. It's got that kind of, widespread public automatic sympathy. The same can't be said of the governments of the Middle East. And I guess one way of looking at this is to look at the role of the Egyptian government, because I've described one pillar of Western foreign policy in the Middle East, which is support for the state of Israel. Biggest recipient of US military aid. Who's the second biggest recipient? Egypt. So what's going on here? The Israelis are paid to keep the Arabs down, and the Egyptians are paid not to attack them. That's the basic architecture, and Saudis likewise. That's the architecture of the Middle East. So, and this produces, of course, a huge crisis between what the mass of people think and what their governments are doing. But hey, not exactly new in this country or anywhere else. But that's how that kind of symbiosis between what the utterly corrupt and dictatorial regimes in most Middle Eastern countries do, and their attitude towards the state of Israel. Of course, one of the things that's utterly thrown this into chaos is precisely the Arab revolutions. Egypt is central to this. Egypt is the central country in the Middle East. It's the most industrialized, the most populous. Its weight it far exceeds that of any other country. And of course, the immediate impact of the popular revolution was to open up a more friendly, let's not put it any higher than that, attitude towards the Palestinians, the partial opening of the Rafah crossing, and so forth and so on. The immediate effect of the army coup that has put the current El-Sisi government in place is to have closed that crossing absolutely. Not only closed it, by the way, but they are busy for a 5-mile wide border now destroying houses on the Egyptian side so that nothing can get through to the Gaza Strip. So it's that relationship between, it's a sort of triangular relationship between the Israelis, the Arab governments and the Arab masses that triangulates what's happening, and this has always been absolutely essential. The old saying that the road to Jerusalem runs through Cairo is meant to indicate that the Palestinian question, there can't be peace in the Middle East without a resolution of the Palestinian question, but there can't be a resolution of the Palestinian question without taking into account the wider social, economic, imperial dynamics of the whole region. On the question of the marches, people often ask me this about the Iraq War, and you've asked a similar question about the Palestine question. I can understand why people thought that when we got 2 million people on the streets that the government that would kind of be it. That the government would kind of realise that the vast majority of people in this country didn't want this and would kind of cut it out as a bad idea. But that isn't really how historical processes work. It isn't that we run on from one side of the stage waving the Stop the War banner and all the bad people run off the other side of the stage twirling their moustaches and we win. It doesn't really work like that. It's a longer, deeper process than that, and this is a longer, deeper process as well. So I would say that we haven't seen the full effects of those mobilisations, and those mobilisations, particularly over Gaza, have continued last summer. That was the biggest ever demonstration, the third demonstration, was 3 in a month, that's pretty historic, and the last one was the biggest ever demonstration in this country over Palestine, and we're beginning to see the impact, and you could see it in the parliamentary vote. That's a group of people who don't want to do that. They really don't want to vote to recognise Palestinian statehood. They've never done it before. They get there like a zillion years too late. That's pressure that does that. When the British government lost the vote over bombing Syria, that was pressure built up over 10 years. And sometimes that's how movements start. When the Tolpuddle martyrs were sent to Australia for forming a trade union, they lost. But we got trade unions in the end. When the suffragettes fought for the vote, they didn't get it till 1928. A decade or more after they first started campaigning, and actually when the height of the movement had been passed. You have an impact, but you've got to keep at it. You can't let them have the room to breathe and regroup. You've got to keep the pressure up, and we've got to extend the ways in which we fight. I think the demonstrations are absolutely vitally important, but so is the BDS movement, so is the boycott, disinvestment and sanctions movement, where you can see the effect now of the isolation of the Israeli state. Of course, it's always going to win a military struggle with the Palestinians because it's so overwhelmingly militarily decisive. But it didn't win easily last time. It won with some losses, more losses than the Israeli public likes, and at the utter destruction of its political reputation internationally. And those are important staging post towards where we need to be.
Okay, so now there's like 3 questions. Should we do Lewis at the back and then that way? Okay.
Yeah, it's not really a question, more of a comment. But I just wanted to pick up where John left off about what we can do here, because I think that John's made it clear what a strong and important ally the UK government is of Israel. You know, with it's not just the government as well as the press, the politicians, and the big arms companies all back Israel ideologically, militarily, financially, and so on. And so I think that one of the key things we can do here is to make sure that any movement that is against the government, whether it's the anti-war movement or the trade unions or strike, or the student demonstration that's happening next week, it's important that we raise the issue of Palestine. And I think that means two things concretely here on Sussex campus and other university campuses. And the first is that the UCU union, which is the lecturers union, the trade union for lecturers, does have a policy of boycott, divestments and sanctions against Israel. And the NUS historically just also passed a vote to employ BDS as a policy as well. So I think that's, the fact that trade unions and students' unions on campuses do have an active BDS motion is something that we can campaign around here to try and organise something around an academic boycott. But then the second thing I think is that in the student demo on Wednesday the 19th that's happening in central London, there's going to be an anti-war block with the slogan of books, not bombs. And I think that, as Sussex, we should go down with lots of Palestinian flags. The fact that we've got a strong PALSOC is important, and we should be raising the issue of Palestine on that demonstration.
John, are you next?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, you talked about the special relationship between Israel and the United States as one driven primarily by geopolitical concerns. Yet in recent years, there's been an increased attention on how the unconditional support of Israel has actually undermined the US strategic interest. And now there are a number of scholars positing that the nature of that relationship today can be largely explained not by geopolitics, but by the influence of the pro-Israel lobby. I was wondering if you could talk a little on the influence of the Israel lobby here in the UK and what the implications are for British policy towards Israel.
I just wanted to ask, you mentioned the Arab Spring in regards to Israel. I wanted to know if the Arab Spring really did cause any legislative change in the Knesset or in Israel in general.
Okay, I think that's 3 questions.
Yeah, well, I certainly think it's true that there is a powerful Zionist lobby in the United States, and as ever, I'm sure people in the room realise it's very important that it's described in that way, as a Zionist lobby, not a Jewish lobby. The most prominent Zionist, of course, in British politics is Michael Gove, and he's not Jewish. And in America, Joe Biden is a Zionist, but he's not Jewish. The Secretary of State is not Jewish, but he is a Zionist, and it's a political project. It's a political point of view. It's not an ethnic or religious designation. And of course, on the other side of it, there are many, many very prominent anti-Zionist, pro-Palestinian Jews. The lobby itself, yeah, it exists. It's certainly well organised and powerful, but I don't think it's the driver of American foreign policy. To be honest, I think the argumentation that puts such stress on it is in danger of sliding into A, conspiracy theory, and B, into a kind of unacceptable anti-Semitism, to be honest. The American state doesn't need to be told by a Jewish lobby that its interests in the Middle East are absolutely essential. It just doesn't. It's essential for American capitalism that it keeps control of this area of the globe geopolitically and in resource terms. It may be true that you can get oil from Venezuela, or you can get oil out of the tar sands of Alberta, Canada, but to get it out of the tar sands of Alberta, Canada, it costs you $7 a barrel. To get it out of Saudi Arabia, it costs you $2 a barrel. So it's not the case that it's the only place you can get oil, but it is the place where you can get the most profitable oil in the world. And that's what capitalism works on. It doesn't work on any commodity. It's not an essential commodity. It works on profit. If it's profitable to produce life-saving drugs, it'll produce life-saving drugs. If it's profitable to produce fluffy dice that you hang from the rear view mirror of your car, it'll produce fluffy dice that you hang from the rear view mirror of your car, because that's what makes a profit. And this commodity, oil, is not just a commodity, it is the commodity of modern capitalism. Now perhaps its age is passing, but it ain't passed yet. Because it's not just about what keeps the cars on the road, it's about every conceivable thing that you can think of. If we were to start stripping out from this room the products that depend on oil, all the plastics would go, all the pharmaceuticals would go, quite a lot of the clothes you're wearing, slightly embarrassingly, would go. So this is the commodity of modern capitalism, that is the profitable commodity of modern capitalism, and it doesn't need a Jewish lobby to get the Americans to the point of view where they understand that this is central. This is a force in domestic politics, it's true, but it's not the main driver of it, it's a subsidiary driver of it. And I think the analysis that say otherwise have got the tail wagging the dog, and I don't think that's what's happening. I do think that there is a crisis, though. I think the thing you're right about is that there is the beginnings of a crisis in American-Israeli relations, and that's a product of, well, it's a product of multiple causation. It's a product of the fact that the Israeli state, the expansionism of the Israeli state, is reaching such a point that it's becoming unsustainable argument in public opinion. I mean, nobody believes that this is an imperiled state that's simply defending itself from, nobody who watches the last 3 wars that the Israelis have been involved in can conceivably believe that that's what's going on, and most people don't. The catastrophe that America created in the Middle East because of the Iraq War has made it less able to control events in that region. The Arab revolutions made it still less able to control events in the region, and because of that, not just the Israeli state, but various other states in the region, the Saudi state, the Turkish state, are now beginning to play a more independent role than they did before. Plus there are non-state actors, as they are called, who are also playing a role. So it's a much more complex picture because of the disaster produced by the Iraq War, which the Americans are less able to control. And so the Israelis, among others, are beginning to conduct operations which kind of are outside the immediate frame of interest of the Americans. Now, let's not overstate this. This is still a very close relationship. When the Israelis wanted to bomb the Iranian nuclear reactors under George Bush told them, "You're not doing it," and they didn't do it. They tried to do it again under Obama, and Obama said, "You're not doing it," and they didn't do it. So that level of control is still very high, but diminishing, I think.
Was that, did you get an answer for the Arab Spring?
Sorry, let's say that again.
I just wanted to know, as a result of the Arab Spring, were there any new legislation that came in?
I don't think it has. I don't think very much has an effect on the main driver. I think of Israeli policy is the fact that the Israeli politics is being driven by the right, and the right in Israeli politics is a long way to the right of where the right is in most states' politics. I think they received. You can't have your ambassador kicked out of Cairo, your embassy burnt down, thousands of people in the street, which is what happened in actually what was a relatively minor incident in the entire Egyptian revolution, without this beginning to have an effect on you. One of the things that it did also, one of the consequences of the Arab Revolution was to produce out of Turkey a bigger distance, a reversal actually of Turkish support for Israel and an open hostility to Israel. So I think not just in terms of public opinion, but there's been an erosion of diplomatic support. And as we see, even the British Parliament's got as far, and the Swedish Parliament and so on have got as far as voting for a Palestinian statehood in however limited and circumscribed a way. So I think these are consequences. They're the consequences of both the Arab revolutions and of the failure in Iraq over a period of time, I think.
Okay. Another 3 questions? Anyone? Questions?
We've seen, obviously, over the past 3 years what seems like a concerted attempt by Western powers through Saudi Arabia and through their allies in the Gulf to basically get Assad out by whatever means, whether it's by funding some very nasty groups that have now morphed into ISIS, or you know, to allow thousands of fighters through into Syria. Under Assad, although a brutal dictatorship, Syria was, even though sometimes limited, it was one of the pro-Palestinian states within the area. So I wondered sort of what the US plan is to almost get a pro-Israel state where there is now Syria, and whether, you know, it will have any major effect, having the last sort of state in the area that was pro-Palestinian gone.
Any other questions? Jared?
Yeah, I just want to mention a few things. So, first thing, in response to my question, you it's almost like there's a caveat where you had to say, you mentioned the word Jewish like 10 times. I didn't mention it once in my question, so I'm not. My position actually, a lot of Jewish scholars talk about the Zionist, the pro-Israel lobby, right? So I think that was unnecessary. I just wanted to mention more specifically. So you're mentioning that there's a crisis between American and Israeli relations, but then at the same time it's almost like there's a paradox, because you're saying there's a crisis and then no, the US still controls them, the relationship is still working as it's always been working, and then but then you're not accounting for the change in the relationship. So what the position put forward by people like Edward Said and Norman Finkelstein in the past has been that yes, the relationship became very strong after 1967, and that facilitated the pro-Israel lobby to be able to secure a hold on US politics, right? So, for example, if you have to look at kind of sub-state processes when you're understanding foreign policy. It's not a case that I'm saying that geostrategy is not important, but you have to also look at who's making policy, right? How does that process of foreign policy production work? If you look at, say, a congressman in the United States, if he gets elected and then within 2 years he has to be re-elected, it's not worth his time to be criticizing Israel, because he's going to end up getting flack by groups like ADL and AIPAC. And that's essentially what I was talking about. I was wondering if you could talk about that in the UK. I'm not saying that the entire thing is some kind of conspiracy, and so I just wanted to clarify my position. And the second thing is just a small point on Turkey. Turkey actually, its relationship with Israel was damaged way before the start of the Arab Spring. Because you're talking from Operation Cast-Lead and then what happened with the Marmara on. That's really what happened. Even since then, I would say that the relationship was actually, in practice, actually improved, even if Erdogan's rhetoric remains populist in order to appeal to his own bloc. That's all I wanted to say.
I think, okay, maybe because John gave us so much to reply, so maybe we'll get to your question after that, so that it's not confusing.
Yeah, I wasn't replying to you directly about that. I was replying about the effect of those kind of analyses. And I think one effect of those kind of analyses, which says it's the Jewish lobby in the States, is to produce that thing. So I was guarding against not what you said, but about one consequence of the theory that you were mentioning. Sub-state actors, yeah, well, there's a kind of presumption there that what happens is that senators or members of Congress make foreign policy in the States, but they don't. Well, that's made by an entirely different group of people. So any electoral pressure on them is a secondary matter. Foreign policy in the United States is decided by the NSA, the CIA, the President's Office, the Secretary of State for Defense. That's the foreign policy establishment in the States. And frankly, Congress has never had, or Senate has never had very much say in it. As you know, the executive orders are issued. The American president doesn't have to even go to Congress over declaring war necessarily. It's just not what happens. So I think you're kind of overstating the effect of electoral politics on the formation of foreign policy. And in this country too, foreign policy is always the most stable most cross-party agreed element of policy. It's about what the British state or the American state does, and nearly all bourgeois politicians accept the definition of that, and the discussions within it aren't even party discussions. There may be different positions, as there is between the so-called Arabist wing of the British foreign policy elite and other more pro-Zionist wings, but that isn't a party division, and it's not something which ever gets out in front of the public in an election. So that's just another reason why I don't really buy that particular theory. I agree about the change in Turkish politics, and I agree about the degree to which a lot of it is rhetoric on Erdogan's part. But that's a change. That's what is diplomatic isolation. It's not that they're cutting off the supplies or anything like that, but there's a change in the atmosphere there. I think the sort of neo-Ottomanism foreign policy of the Turks has made, I think, Israel more isolated than before. I think with the American-Israeli relationship, I don't see the contradiction between saying, yes, there's been a diminution in the degree of alignment between the two things, but that it hasn't reached the point which has made a fundamental change to it. Seems to be a perfectly logical thing to say. Now, if it continues in this direction, there will become a tipping point. And it's worth noting that erosion has taken place, and it's worth thinking about whether we will reach a tipping point. But I think some people say that point's been reached. My view is that it hasn't been reached, and I gave a couple of very good reasons about a absolutely central issue for the Israelis, the development of the Iranian nuclear program, why that was the case. On the question of Syria, I think we've kind of, the goalposts keep moving for the Americans. Yes, they set out with the view that they could get rid of Assad, and this would be a good thing because the axis of evil included, as they constantly kept saying, Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas. That was the axis of evil. But obviously, the process of the unfolding of events in Syria has disrupted that initial starting point, to the degree now, of course, that the American bombing of the Islamic State in Syria couldn't possibly be taking place without the tacit agreement of the Syrian regime, because the Syrian regime has the kind of anti-aircraft weaponry which could bring down American planes, and the Americans wouldn't be running those missions unless they got agreement with the Assad regime, and you can see why the Assad regime would make that agreement about that. So I think the political kind of alignment has changed because of the failure of, yet again, the failure of American foreign policy. What did they think they were doing at the beginning? They thought they were going to back the Free Syrian Army, give it arms, it would overthrow Assad, they would have a pro-American or more pro-American regime. That went so badly wrong. American backing for the FSA, actually, in the eyes of many Syrians who are anti-imperialist anyway, diminished it. In any way, the IS took its arms off it and started using it. This became a failure of a policy, so then the FSA were cut off from receiving any more arms. In recent months, they've been put back on to receiving arms because of the growth of the Islamic State, not to any great effect. So I think the mess that's been created here, the chaos that's been created here, is making a situation which is much different to the original war on terror. When the Americans started the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, the neoconservatives had a plan. That it was regime change, they were going to do it by a full-scale, proper military invasion. That was the plan. Now, it may have been so hideously at variance with reality that it turned into this disaster, but at least it was a plan. I don't think they've got a plan now. I think the failure of the original plan and the instability created by the Arab revolutions has created a circumstance in which they don't have the options that they had before, which is why they're increasingly trying to operate either through proxy states in the region, the Saudis and so forth, or by non-state actors like the FSA on the ground, or in some cases, as in Iraq, barely distinguishable things between the Iraqi state and non-state actors. So I think this is a kind of interregnum of chaos out of which they will have to begin to reassert themselves at one point, but they haven't found a way of doing so yet.
Okay, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, because recently over the summer, with the summer attacks on Gaza, a lot more people have been aware of the issue and a lot more people have spoken out against Israeli aggression. Do you think that it's in any way affecting the Zionist lobby in funds or BDS or anything, even awareness? Is it affecting Israel in any way?
Guys, any more questions?
There are two facets kind of to my inquiry. First of all, as you know, maybe perhaps there's increasing rapprochement now between America and not only the Assad regime, but Iran as well. It seems that America is actually taking a shift from, possibly starting a shift from putting its main eggs in the Saudi basket, putting it in the Iranian basket. So in that kind of way of thinking, and also responding to what first of all, how does that affect the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in your eyes? Iran is blunted, let's say. And secondly, in terms of what, responding to what you just said, I find it difficult to believe or accept that the West, or the USA rather, really ever wanted the Syrian rebellion, whether the FSA or anything, to succeed. Because if that was the case, they would have backed them. You talk about arming. This arming thing is, to be honest, in terms of general implications, it's quite a myth, because they armed them very, very, very little. It was almost like token arming. That's the reason ISIS and these other forces came into being, because the moderates had completely don't have the ability and don't have the funding. So yeah, just a comment on that is, if they wanted to arm them, they would have given them anti-aircraft missiles, they would have given them anti-tank missiles, they would have given all these things for 3 years. But yeah, just a comment, because I feel it's very problematic to keep repeating this kind of matter.
Well, I'll come back on those. I think the support for the Palestinian cause in the summer and before that, in 2009 and 2006, or opposition to Israel in 2006, I think has had an effect on them. Yeah, I think they feel the effect of that. You can see when, I don't know whether you saw the comparisons of the Twitter hashtags between the support for the Palestinians and the support for the Israelis, where it massively, the pro-Palestinian was massively outflanked them. Now the Israeli state obviously isn't going to fall because of a hashtag, but it's an indicator of how isolated that Zionist position is. And you only have to think back to what that used to be. It used to be virtually an unchallengeable situation that in some way you supported the state of Israel. When I came into politics in the 70s, that territory, the landscape of that looked completely different. There were many people on the left who, I was never one of them, but there were people on the left who thought that because there were kibbutz in Israel, it was some, close to socialism or something. Now that landscape that's gone. That is completely history, that whole mental landscape now. So I think, and I think, as I say, there are reports going from the former head of Mossad to the Israeli cabinet saying we have a problem. We have a problem with public perception of what's going on here. So yeah, I think that does have an effect. I think the sort of tilt to Iran has got a long way to go now. The fact that Obama links progress on the nuclear deal with the question of whether or not they'll accept Iranian support over fighting ISIS tells you how far it's got to go. If they really wanted it, they could disconnect those two things. They could say, okay, whatever happens with this process over the nuclear discussion, of course ISIS is a big problem and we want to solve it together. That would be a perfectly logical, if not necessarily acceptable in the United States, but it would be a perfectly logical foreign policy attitude to have. But they're not. They're connecting the two. They're making the two things connected, which means...
How are they doing that?
Well, this is what.
Connecting them when
Well, this is what Obama said in his speech. He said either we get progress and we're going to have a deal on nuclear weapons or on the nuclear facilities, or we aren't having an alliance over IS.
But they have a real life alliance now in Syria. How are they connecting? I don't care really about rhetoric. I'm talking about daily.
No, but it's not rhetoric because
how when they've allowed
Hezbollah
to come in
because
a year ago into Syria and they didn't challenge it. America didn't say anything about it.
About what? Sorry.
When they allowed Hezbollah into Syria.
Yeah, of course, but
all this, and now they're striking even rebels besides ISIS. As you might have heard.
And that de facto has changed. Or let's put it this way: it's not a change in American policy. It's something that's happening on the ground that the Americans can't do anything about. So it's not that there's you were suggesting that there's been a foreign policy shift in balance from the Saudis to the Iranians. I'm saying, despite the fact that on the ground this is happening, this isn't a product of a foreign policy change. It's something which is happening because of the nature of the Iraqi government, principally, and it's something that the Americans couldn't change, even if they wanted to change it, and perhaps they still do want to change it. So that is simply a realpolitik acceptance of fact on the ground you can't change. That's not the same as a change in foreign policy. With the FSA, they didn't get much arms, but they were the Americans' chosen successors to the Assad regime, because you don't get the leaders of the FSA stood up beside Hillary Clinton in the Istanbul conference and all patting each other on the back. The FSA didn't have to issue statements saying we support the right-wing Cuban exiles in Florida. That's a pitch to get American support, which they didn't get. But they did enough, the Americans did enough in the arming and the courting of the FSA, and the FSA were dim enough to do enough to put themselves on the side of the Americans that it eroded their support inside Syria, because most Syrians don't want that to happen. And that's what created the vacuum out of which the Islamic State and people who looked more militant and actually willing to fight and actually being effective, that's out of what it grew. So my line is not the defence of Assad, my line is this: that some of the sections of the opposition to Assad sold themselves to the Americans, which demobilised their support inside Syria, which allowed the Islamic State to grow. And I think that was a mistake.
Well, I mean, when you say the FSA, I mean, you have to be very, very careful. You're saying that, first of all, you're talking about the Syrian National Council, I presume, or committee, which is not recognized by a lot of sections of the FSA.
Look.
Yeah, a lot of other rebels like Islamic Front.
Yeah, but it happened. But it was enough to make it happen.
When you say FSA as a monolithic movement, that's something that there is a very big mistake in there, because the FSA is divided. In the current structure, you can have an FSA leader who you can quote, like you did regarding.
I know all that.
You make now a blanket statement. So
but what I'm saying is I know that on the ground it's a dispersed and decentered movement.
Yeah.
But the trouble is, if you let the Americans pick your leaders, if you get some of those people stood up, everybody, not just me, but people on the ground in Syria are going to look at that person and say, yeah, they're the one the Americans are talking to. What you should have done is say, we aren't going none of us, nobody's going anywhere near Hillary Clinton. Nobody's going to say, yeah, the Americans have got a role in this.
And they're going to get weapons from Russia?
Well, I'm just telling you what has happened as a result of allowing that to happen. You can have a different attitude, by the way. You can have the attitude that the Palestinians have. The Palestinians don't turn around and start begging various imperial powers to back them up. And on the occasions when they did do that, it destroyed the organisation that did it and led to the rise of Hamas. So the lesson here is, do not do deals with the major imperial powers, because it erodes your standing among the people below you, allows them to play a role, and demobilises the struggle generally. It's basic anti-imperialist politics.
Yes,
that's the difference. That's the difference. That's the difference.
With Russia, because obviously
well, let me just say one thing about that. I don't advocate that either. But if I had a choice between taking weapons from a weak imperial power with very little footprint in the region and a strong imperial power that's wrecked the region for a century, that's where I'd go. Now, actually, as a matter of fact, I wouldn't do either. But if you had a choice and you thought those were the choices, any sensible
Add that to
anti-imperialist
the
chooses.
Syrians being bombed now by Assad, say
Okay.
you prefer Russian imperialism than American imperialism.
Yeah,
Rather than all Russian
I'm just
American
telling you what's happening.
Guys,
can
we can
I
discuss
interrupt?
this after, like, we're
Yeah, like it's not that it's irrelevant. It's just that like this isn't
We're
literally direct,
focusing on
like
Palestine.
related to like the talk that we're having. But like obviously you're more than welcome if you're both up for it, and whoever wants to doesn't stay behind afterwards. But like, can we just get back to it? Yeah.
You mentioned Hamas in this discussion. I was just wondering why, like, I understand Hamas being a terrorist group is a widely accepted, like, fact, but why is it? Is it because they've bombed Israel? And then if so, isn't that seen as freedom fighters or just resistance fighters in general?
Yeah, I mean, I would never use that language about Hamas. It's an armed resistance movement, and it has the right to defend itself. Even the UN Charter agrees that people have got the right to defend themselves against occupation. So yes, I take that view. But this is part of the way in which the major powers create a certain form, a certain lens through which you view these things. I mean, look at the situation with the Kurds. The Iraqi Kurds are good Kurds. They're involved in an armed struggle, they're fighting ISIS, they're good Kurds. The PKK, on the other hand, who are also Kurds in Turkey but are fighting for independence from the Turkish state, they're terrorists. They're still on the terrorist blacklist in this country and in the European Union as a terrorist organisation. So, you know, this is a totally subjective designation. Now, there are some people who, there are some small groups who do use terrorist methods for political ends. But the extension of that definition to people who are fighting for national liberation has always struck me as simply a way of trying to rule their struggle out as illegitimate without discussing the issue.
Is Hezbollah seen as a terrorist organisation to the EU?
I assume it's on the list. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? David?
Yeah, you spoke about the importance of oil in American support for Israel. I'm trying to work out, I'm wondering in what way Israel helps America to control oil resources, because Israel doesn't have any oil. It occupies the Golan Heights in Syria, but that doesn't have any oil,
No.
I think. America independently has its own relationship with Saudi Arabia, with Iraq, with the Iraqi Kurds. So I'm wondering in what way Israel does help America to control oil.
In the general sense that it acts as a kind of policeman for the Middle East, and we know that some of the wars that have taken place have been directly between not just Israel and the Palestinians, but between Israel and a large number of Arab states. So it acts as a kind of pole of and base of military operations and strategic projection of force in the whole region. I suppose one way of looking at it would be to think, what would the Middle East look like if the state of Israel didn't exist, if that huge armed camp, the 8th most powerful military power in the world, were excised from the Middle East. I think it's hard not to think that the freedom for manoeuvre and the kind of impulse for Arab independence wouldn't be strengthened by its removal. I suppose the sort of, the what if thing is an illustration of that, I think.
Yeah.
So I think you're absolutely right there, but I think the conditions have changed. So that's why after Israel showed how the extent of its military capacity in 1967, that's what created the special relationship, because then it was seen as, listen, Israel can play a huge role in undermining pan-Arab nationalism. But now that that's gone, and since then, with perhaps globalization, more people find out about what's happening in the occupied territories, since public opinion has changed so much toward Israel, as you mentioned yourself, I think that now the anti-Americanism caused by the nature of that special relationship, and I don't mean the relationship per se, but the unconditional nature of every Israeli policy, that actually creates more geostrategic problems for the US than it does by unconditionally supporting them. And I do think, despite the Iran example you gave, that it is an unconditional is a relationship of unconditional support. And I think that when we look at that, we need to think, okay, why is that support unconditional when it's damaging the US interest? And that's why I think the argument that it can be explained through the Israel lobby is so useful. And it's not just, and you mentioned the electoral politics thing, it's not just that. I mean, there's huge influence on the executive too. I mean, every year, people, the President, Secretary of State, Defense Secretary, they're all swearing this kind of allegiance to Israel. APAC's, the American Israel Partnership Affairs Committee annual conference. Even there was a scandal with, I've forgotten his name now. Obama chose a new defense secretary who had previously criticized the lobby. What was his name?
Chuck Hagel?
Yeah, Chuck Hagel. Obama chose Chuck Hagel as his new defense sec maybe 2 years ago. And because he had previously criticized the relationship, there was a huge scandal in which he was then felt obliged, and he did then apologize for making those remarks and reaffirm his support for Israel in a way that should not really be expected of an executive of a state. And so that's why we can't just look at this purely through a geostrategic lens, because it's actually undermining the geostrategic interest. It needs to be understood in another way, and I say that way is through.
I get what you're saying. I just don't agree with it. It is fundamentally implausible to argue that America does no longer have a strategic geopolitical interest.
No, that's not the argument at all. The argument is there's an interest there, but that interest is.
You see, I allowed you to deploy your argument. You allowed me to deploy my answer. It is fundamentally implausible to say that the geostrategic interest in the alliance with Israel has been undermined. But the only thing that's keeping it in place is that there's a highly motivated lobby in the United States that's forcing the entire American government and its security apparatus to keep arming these people at incredible cost every single year to, on your account, their own political embarrassment. That is you're trying to balance an insupportably large fact on an incredibly thin stem, and it just won't hold.
Well, that's just a straw man argument, because I'm not saying that there's not a geostrategic interest in supporting Israel, but that it's undermining the US
You do
interest.
keep saying that. You keep saying it was there in 1967. It's gone now. That's what you said.
No, I didn't. Actually, I said it was.
All right. But in which case we agree. There is a geostrategic interest.
Yeah.
There are some people who support this geostrategic interest in the United States. Of course, that's a secondary matter in my view. We agree. Great. Can we move on now?
Any other questions? Yeah.
I have a question about the possibility of, if America had not supported the Israeli regime, then there would be a no holds bar on what Israel could do within the region. So is there a possibility that America needs to kind of keep a vicious dog on a chain from attacking everyone in the region? Because as you said, the Americans are the ones that had to go and tell them to stop being ridiculous and not bomb Iran. And that if America had to completely kind of start withdrawing support, you'd get an incredibly more aggressive Israel, because it would be required to be more aggressive to maintain its tiny position within the region. So it would end up striking back at all the states and taking more land and being more aggressive, and just sort of making itself into a kind of military dictatorship in the middle of the Middle East that there's already enough of.
Yeah, I think the dog on the chain analogy is a good one, and you have to keep the dog fed, but you have to keep the dog under control, and that's the relationship between the United States and the Israelis. I don't think the Israelis can kind of get off the American chain, because if serious American support for the Israeli state stopped for a week, the state would disappear. It's sustained by funding and armaments to such a degree, and diplomatically and strategically and in all sorts of other ways as well, that it would simply cease to exist, given its imperiled position inside the Middle East anyway. So yes, I think it's sustained by, and because it's sustained by, controlled by the Americans to a very large degree. I don't want to say it can't get out of hand. Your dog can slip the leash. Your dog can bite the owner. There are a number variants of this thing, but the normal situation is that the dog is on the lead.